end of every unit, your teacher has the chance to teach a lesson about other lessons in their context to enhance. But what do you suppose our teacher has us do? He skips the lesson and makes us present a digital LEQ. Elocution needs historical evidence, reasoning that can corroborate in advance a complex thesis that Dr. John P. Irish would admire. Then we drop the screencast like a single. That's fire. Student created screencast for you to like, subscribe, and share. We know you've had all the John Green and Steve Hermler you can bear. If we have the most views by 10 p.m. on the 5th day, we earn 500 bonus points with virtually guarantees an A. Without much more fanfare overdue, we present our digital LEQ.
Want to see me run to that mountain and back? You want to see me do it again?
Hello class, and welcome back to another Digital LEQ screencast. Today, we're going to discuss China and Japan's response to Western imperialism in the 19th century. Our class 4B, and let's get into it. Here are our big idea questions. Number 1, how did the responses from Japan and China show the different effects of Western penetration? Number 2, how did the different responses of China and Japan determine the influence imperialism had on their economic status? And number 3, why is understanding how these two areas in East Asia reaction to Western penetration important in order to meaningfully compare the two responses? We will later review and discuss these questions and their answers after the Google slide presentation. Heading into our prompt. Our prompt states, analyze and compare the different responses of China and Japan to Western penetration in the 19th century. Heading right into our thesis. Imperialism is the domination of a nation's authority over other nations through economic, military, political, and religious rationale. In the 19th century, Western imperialism became the way European states established vast empires, mainly in Africa, but also in Asia and the Middle East. China and Japan were two of many areas impacted by this, which is Western penetration. However, their reactions encompass two different kinds of responses to how imperialism can influence a country. Japan pursuing their own imperialist objective, and China being territorially and commercially dominated by Europeans. An overview of what to expect in our historical context, we have Western imperialism. Chinese and Japan responses varied. Large Western influence on the central civilizations, and wars and rebellions, Opium and Zulu Wars, along with Boxer Rebellion. Chinese responses to Western imperialism. Chinese responses, Part 1. During the 19th century, China was a more isolated figure in the age of industrialization. China had minimal contact with other countries outside of their boundaries. They were not open to influence of other countries coming in and changing their way of life. So when Western imperialism came along, in addition to Great Britain's support of it, made China furious. Great Britain, unlike China, advocated for forming alliances with other nations and sharing resources with other countries. However, to get these resources, they desperately wanted and needed trade routes, which many ran through China. Chinese responses, Part 2. Britain soon demanded China to open up trade ports, and they also could use China, and China disapproved of foreign control, which led to many brutal rebellions. Back to our historical context, the Boxer Rebellion. We also have the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars. The Boxer Rebellion was an uprising against foreigners that occurred in China and around the time period of 1900 and begun by peasants, but eventually supported by the government. A Chinese secret society known as the Boxers embarked on a violent campaign to drive all foreigners from China. Chinese responses, Part 3. The Taiping Rebellion was a revolt against the Qing dynasty in China, fought with religious conflict over regional economic conditions, and lasting from 1850 to about 1864. Chinese Taiping Rebellion in the mid-1800s was the bloodiest civil war in human history. If you look to your right, this painting was created by a civilian trying to portray the extensive amount of King soldiers involved in the battle. Moving into Japanese responses to Western influence. Japanese responses, Part 1. In the early 1700s, Japan was closed itself off from almost all communication with no other nations. The Japanese had little to no contact with the industrialized world during that time period. Under the rule of the shoguns, Japanese society was very tightly run. The working class worked for and lived under protection of their daimyo, which is the one great lord that was vassals of the shoguns. And this small army of samurai or warriors, this tight system kept the country free of civil war. This system also kept a population peaceful. Japanese responses part 2. During the 19th century, Japan's economy and society began to face rapid change and transforming from an isolated state to a nation of industrialized power established by the Meiji Restoration. This opened culture to new ideas of industrialization and government that was influenced by Western power. Basically, this is telling you that Japanese influence was starting to change towards Western imperialism as they start to embrace Western imperialism. This opened their culture to new ideas, and Japan was relatively open to these values and felt the need for modernization. In the process of becoming an industrialized power, Japan slowly opened up to the idea of change with exchange with Western powers. In doing so, the nation grew to its technology advancements and new trade with the West while keeping their traditional culture and values. Japanese responses part 3. The term shogun, which means general who quelled barbarians. Going back to our historical context, we mentioned shoguns in our topics of what we're going to overview. Getting into shoguns, these warlords were heavily involved in the general public. Looking at the picture to your right, so when creating paintings and drawings centered around shoguns, they were depicted in big, bulky, and extravagant suits such as the one shown in the figure to the right. This is a primary source showing how shoguns were involved in the general public's life, and the big, bulky clothing showed how powerful they were and how much power they possessed in the general public's life. Going into our AP Modern World History theme analysis. These are our themes: cultural developments and interactions, which is the Western influence on Chinese and Japan society. We have governance, which is the presence of shoguns in Japan, and social interactions and organization, which falls into treaty development between Britain and China. Review of our big ideas. So, going back to our big ideas, we want you guys to pause and see if you guys got these answers correct. Coming back in to review our big ideas. Number 1, how did the responses from Japan and China show the effects of Western penetration? Our team and our answers developed, saying while both countries saw Western power impose an economic and political influence, they responded very differently. The effects of Western imperialism had a big impact on industrialization, economic, political influence in both areas. Number 2, how did the differing responses of China and Japan determine the influence imperialism had on their economic status? Because China resisted and isolated themselves from the influence of Western penetration, their economy began to decline drastically, which is why Europeans stepped in and tried to dominate China as a whole. Japan, on the other hand, quickly transformed its economy and had a period of fast industrial growth that resulted in Japan becoming a world power. Going back to what we discussed in our PowerPoint slides, Japan adapted to imperialism and more likely had a better modernization period, which allowed them to have fast industrial growth, which resulted in them becoming a world power. And our last question, why is understanding how the two areas in East Asia reaction to Western penetration important in order to meaningfully compare the two responses? In order to meaningfully compare the two, you have to know all the factors that affected Japan and China, whether they were political, economical, military, or religious rationale. Understanding the effects can overall help compare responses to the same or different factors. Japan pursuing their own imperialist objective, and China being territorially and commercially dominated by Europeans. Our contextualization. This is a summary of what we covered in our topic. In the period of the 19th century, Europeans used Western penetration to excel and expand their empire. China and Japan were two subregions that were impacted in two different ways and handled the action of imperialism in separate ways. China was completely dominated and were subjected to what the Europeans wanted for them, whether to be push product into their region or to handle exportation of goods and textiles. Japan, on the other hand, took imperialism as a challenge and a way for them to use ideas from imperialism and implement them into a plan of action to control parts of East Asia and expand culture and participate in the trade industry. All in all, reactions from both China and Japan changed the way imperialism can be viewed and responded to, which is a major turning point in the 19th century. Here's our sources, which are most are secondary, and that is all of our LEQ. We would like to thank our class. We would like to thank anybody who tuned in to watch and enjoy. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Show it to a friend. And hopefully we can win this contest.